Hello and welcome to another GCSE PE related video with Mr. Matthews. I do apologise, I have been away for a while. I've actually had a hair transplant and we're about 9 weeks into my recovery. So that is the reason why I haven't released any videos of myself more recently. But new year, new hairline, soon come, and a new Fitness with Mr. Matthews t-shirt. Wonderful. So firstly, I'd like to say welcome back. Today, I'm going to run through a GCSE PE video that's targeted towards this year's examination. So do please excuse me if I do occasionally glimpse over at my computer screen because I'm just looking at some of the information that's in that document for you. But firstly, you obviously need to know your examination dates. So for paper 1, the exam is to be sat on the 24th of May, obviously 2022. And your paper 2 exam will be sat on the 10th of June. Now, I'm sure your amazing PE teachers have shared a lot of the information that I'm about to share with you, but I thought it would be worthwhile putting all of this information into one single video, so ultimately you can use it as a revision tool. So, as I'm sure you know, AQA shared a document a few weeks ago, and they have summarised each and every topic you need to know for both paper 1 and paper 2 examinations. So today we're going to go through all of the topics for paper 1. And please, before we begin, please let me make it clear that although AQA have kindly shared a lot of topics with us, it's important to note, and I'm going to read this from the sheet that I have before me, that specifies that students and teachers should consider how to focus their revision of other non-listed parts of the specification which may be tested in lower mark questions. So although I'm going to share many of the topics that AQA have mentioned, there's clearly an indication there that you will be questioned on topics that they haven't necessarily noted on this document. So please make sure that you continue to do the revision as you normally would, because of course there will be instances where they ask you questions and you will have to talk about different aspects of the course. And please, before we begin, as always, do not forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. I am going to release a series of videos, shorts, and another video like today's for paper 2 in the next few weeks or so. So if you subscribe and you hit the notification bell, that will obviously act as a reminder for you going forwards and will hopefully prove very helpful. So let's dive into this document. So the first part reads that you have to understand the structure and functions of the muscular and skeletal system, so how they work collectively in order to produce movement. Now, in quite a few of the videos I've made previously, I've spoken about tendons. Tendons attach muscle to bone. So what happens is when we exercise and we experience movement, muscles contract and shorten. And when they contract and shorten, they pull on the tendon. Now, the opposite end of this tendon is attached to a bone. So as the tendon is pulled upon by the muscle, it pulls on the bone, which in turn produces movement. What also happens in terms of movement is that muscles work in antagonistic pairs, and muscles can only pull, they cannot push. So what happens during an exercise, let's say the upwards phase of a bicep curl, the bicep contracts and shortens. So this is responsible for the movement that takes place because it's known as the agonist, it's known as the prime mover. But the tricep, the muscle in the back of the upper arm, allows this to happen as it relaxes and lengthens, which makes it the antagonist. If I straighten my arm, the roles reverse. So as I straighten my arm, the tricep shortens and contracts, and the bicep lengthens and relaxes. To build on this, movement always occurs at joints, and there are 2 types of synovial joint in the body that you need to know, and they are the hinge joint and the ball and socket joint. The hinge joint is found in the elbow, the knee, and the ankle, and the ball and socket joint is found in the shoulder and the hip. Going back to the hinge joint, a bit like a door, if you've watched my previous video, you will understand that a hinge only allows movement in two directions. The hinge joint in the body works in exactly the same way. It only allows movement in two directions. So you can flex, you can experience flexion as the angle of the joint decreases because the lower arm moves closer to the upper arm. And you can only straighten your arm, which is extension, as the angle of the joint increases. In your ankle, you can plantar flex and dorsiflex. So plantar flexion is where you point your toes towards the ground, and dorsiflexion is when your toes point upwards towards your knee. In terms of the ball and socket joint in the shoulder and the hip, this synovial joint allows the greatest range of movement because you can flex, you can extend, you can abduct, you can adduct, you can experience rotation, and you can also carry out circumduction. So let's take a look at the second topic on this helpful document. So it reads that you need to understand the structure and functions of the cardio-respiratory system. And what it says beneath this is you need to understand the structure of blood vessels and their function. So this is an artery, and the first thing you need to know about arteries is that all arteries take blood away, so away from the heart. Most arteries carry oxygenated blood, excluding the pulmonary artery. This transports deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So this is an artery. It has thick muscular walls that also contain elastic fibers. And what this child has tried to do in making this is they've tried to create a thick muscular wall using a thick cloth. I hope you can see that. Now, this is a really good feature because what happens is when the heart ejects oxygenated blood into the aorta, blood is ejected at really, really high pressure. It's traveling very, very quickly. So the artery has to be strong in order to withstand this pressure. The elastic fibers also mean that there's an element of movement in the blood vessel. So again, it can withstand this high pressure. If it didn't have these characteristics, then we'd run the risk of internal bleeding and perhaps damage to our blood vessels, which obviously would not be a good thing. Arteries also have a very small lumen, and the word lumen just refers to the space, the empty space inside the blood vessel. So because of the thick muscular walls, there is less space inside the artery, which again enables it to travel at higher pressure. So arteries transport oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, and this oxygen is used by working muscles. So once oxygen has been used by working muscles, carbon dioxide is produced, and carbon dioxide is taken towards the heart via veins. So all veins carry deoxygenated blood towards the heart, excluding the pulmonary vein that transports oxygenated blood. Now, veins are different to arteries. So going back to our artery, we mentioned thick muscular walls. Veins have thin walls, and the reason being you have to think about the fact that blood has been transported to working muscles and the oxygen in that blood has been used. Now, by the time it reaches a vein, this blood is actually being transported back to the heart. So blood loses its pressure. It's not traveling at the speed it once was. So veins can easily withstand this low pressure, and for that reason, they have thin walls and they have a larger lumen. Remember, the lumen being the space inside the vein. This also means, however, that veins contain valves. So every time the heart beats, these valves open, which enables the blood to move through. And when the heart relaxes, these valves close. And that prevents the backflow of blood. So a very, very important characteristic of a vein. So this is a capillary, and what you will notice straight away is it's very, very small in comparison to an artery and a vein. It has a very, very small lumen, and it also has a wall that is only 1 cell thick. So it's incredibly thin in comparison to an artery. Capillaries are typically found in the extremities, so the fingertips, the toes, but also, as I'm sure you know, cover the alveoli. And this is really useful in terms of supporting diffusion and gaseous exchange. Because they have such thin walls, it enables gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide to move through them very, very easily. So the next topic to be discussed is the mechanics of breathing, thinking about the interaction of the intercostal muscles, ribs and diaphragm when we inhale and when we exhale. So when we inhale, intercostal muscles, which are muscles that are found in between the ribs, contract. And what this does is this moves the ribs up and out, which creates a larger chest cavity. So the space within the chest becomes a lot larger. The diaphragm also contracts and it moves downwards. So again, creating more space within the lungs. As a result of this, the pressure outside of the body is greater than it is inside the body. So air is inhaled through the nose and mouth and travels from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure in the lungs. When we exhale, our diaphragm returns to its dome-like shape. So it relaxes and moves upwards, and the intercostal muscles also relax. Now this causes the ribs to move down and in. So you can imagine that all of a sudden the chest cavity decreases in terms of size. And for that reason, the atmospheric pressure inside the lungs increases, which forces the air from the lungs to the outside environment. It's also worth noting down that our lungs expand during exercise, and this is made possible by the pectorals, which are muscles found in the chest, and the sternocleidomastoid, which are muscles found in the neck. This enables us to take in more oxygen, which will help us cope with the demands of exercise. It's also worth noting down that during exercise, when we exhale, the rib cage is pulled down quicker, which enables air to be forcefully forced out of the lungs into the atmosphere. And this is supported by the abdominal muscles. In relation to this topic, you also need to be able to interpret a spirometer trace. So a spirometer is a piece of equipment that you might use to measure lung volume. So there are 4 types of lung volume that you need to understand. There's tidal volume, there's inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, and residual volume. So let's build on that. I have my small trusty whiteboard to help support your understanding. So tidal volume, I want you to envisage that you're sat down on the beach on your favorite deck chair in the sun watching the tide. The tide comes in and the tide goes out, and it just repeats. That just happens over and over again. So tidal volume is breathing at rest. So it refers to the amount of air that you take in during normal inhalation whilst resting. So to illustrate that on my whiteboard, you will see on the left hand side that tidal volume is illustrated with these small dips. So these small curved lines. So I breathe out, I breathe in, I breathe out, and so on. Now, you need to understand that during exercise, tidal volume increases. And of course it does, because you need to take in more oxygen when partaking in exercise, and you also need to remove more CO2 from the body when exercising. So it's only natural that, of course, tidal volume increases. Now, your second lung volume, inspiratory reserve volume, refers to the extra amount of air you take in on top of tidal volume. Okay, so let's just imagine that we're breathing out, we're breathing in, we're breathing out, we're breathing in, we're breathing out. When I forcefully inhale, that additional amount of air that I take in on top of tidal volume is my inspiratory reserve volume. So it's the extra amount of air that I take in above what I would usually take in at rest. And likewise, if we move down here to ERV, this is expiratory reserve volume. Now, it's exactly the same thing as IRV, but it just refers to the extra additional air that we forcefully breathe out on top of tidal volume. Okay, so I breathe in and then I forcefully breathe out. So I'll do that again for you. I breathe in and I forcefully breathe out. So that extra amount of air that I breathe out on top of tidal volume is expiratory reserve volume. And then at the bottom here, you can see RV. So that's residual volume. So that's the amount of air that remains in the lungs. That never, ever changes. So that's just the amount of air that remains in the lungs, whether we inhale, whether we exhale, whether we inhale deeply, whether we exhale forcefully. Residual volume never changes. It's the amount of air that remains in the lungs. Okay, so just to run through that again. Tidal volume, I'm breathing out, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out, I'm breathing in. I breathe out, I breathe in deeply, I forcefully blow out, and I continue to breathe normally. Now, this is a trace at rest. Obviously, if I were to exercise, these lines would become deeper and higher, so they'd start to take up more space on my whiteboard. And what that would mean is that we would start to eat into our inspiratory reserve volume and our expiratory reserve volume. So during exercise, as tidal volume increases because we're breathing in more, our reserve volumes decrease because all of a sudden there's less volume, there's less reserve volume available because we've eaten into that by breathing in more forcefully during exercise. Let's continue moving through this document. So the next topic that I would like to discuss is aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So let's begin with the equations because you need to know these. So for aerobic respiration, the equation is glucose plus oxygen equals energy plus carbon dioxide plus water. And the important thing here is that there is a presence of oxygen. So when we think about sporting events, aerobic respiration is evident in sports and events that are carried out over long distances. So events like the marathon. We know that the marathon takes a long time to complete. It takes place over a long distance. So therefore, the intensity of the event is low in comparison to other activities like sprinting. If we were to think about anaerobic respiration and the equation being glucose equals energy plus lactic acid, you can see that we've removed the word oxygen. So there's an absence of oxygen during anaerobic events. This does not mean that there is no oxygen in the body, but it just means that respiration has happened in the absence of oxygen. So this will happen during intense activities where intensity is high, but movements are carried out over a short period of time. So an example being sprinting. As well as understanding what aerobic and anaerobic respiration mean and what events they're tied to, it's really important that you understand that aerobic and anaerobic respiration can actually be evident in the same sport. So for example, in a 90-minute game of football, there might be moments where we're working aerobically. So when the ball goes out of play and we're walking from one location to another to get back into our position, this would be an example of aerobic respiration because the intensity is clearly low. However, there might be instances where I'm jumping in the air to compete with another footballer to head the ball. This is a short, powerful movement that happens very, very quickly. So this would happen in the absence of oxygen. There are other scenarios that we might talk about, like sprinting towards a loose ball in order to gain possession. Again, that would be a example of anaerobic respiration. So it's really important that we know that in many disciplines, aerobic and anaerobic respiration can be seen. I spoke about marathon running being aerobic, and it absolutely is, but it's really important that you understand that there will be moments in a marathon where the athlete in question respires anaerobically. So of course, for a large part of the event, they might jog at a steady pace. However, when they near the end of the race, so let's say the last 50 to 100 meters, they might start to work at maximal intensity. So they might start to sprint in order to complete the marathon in the very best time possible, or it might be that they're actually in second place and that they can see the person in first place is only 10 meters in front. So for that reason, they might sprint as quickly as they can, working at maximal effort for a small period of time in order to take their opponent over in an attempt to win the race. Moving on to our next topic, the short-term and long-term effects of exercise. So the short-term effects of exercise occur after exercise up to 36 hours and can include feelings of fatigue, tiredness, dizziness, nausea, delayed onset muscle soreness, and excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. To go back a step, delayed onset muscle soreness just refers to muscular aches that are experienced after exercise as a result of muscles being worked harder than what they are used to. So that would usually happen to muscles that are unaccustomed to exercise, or it might be that you've worked muscles a little bit more intensely in a session than you normally would, and as a result you might experience delayed onset muscle soreness. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is something that we experience after anaerobic activity, and it's where breathing rate quickens and we breathe more deeply. And the reason being is during anaerobic activity, as previously mentioned, there is an absence of oxygen. So oxygen stores are depleted, and for that reason, following exercise, breathing is more intense. The reason being is we're trying to intake more oxygen to replenish oxygen stores to repay the oxygen debt as a result of the activity. So let's move on to our next topic, looking at lever systems, examples of their use in activity. So to begin with, I would like to discuss the different parts that make up each of the lever systems you can see. So you have a fulcrum, which can also be known as the pivot. You have the resistance, which can also be known as the load, and you have the effort. I like to stick with the words fulcrum, resistance and effort because I like to use something called FRE 1, 2, 3. And what that simply means is the fulcrum sits centrally of a first class lever system. So that being my F. R, resistance, sits centrally of my second class lever system. And then finally, E, effort, sits centrally of my third class lever system. So FRE 1, 2, 3. What you also need to know is when you're asked to draw a lever system, you have to draw an arrow to represent the effort, you have to draw a square to represent the resistance, and you have to draw a triangle to represent the fulcrum. Now, moving on from that, if we have a look at the first class lever system, we need to start thinking about sporting examples associated with it. So a couple of examples that I might mention are movement of the neck forwards and backwards. And in that particular scenario, the fulcrum will be the joint that sits just behind the jawbone. The effort will be the muscles in the neck, and the resistance will be the weight of the head. If I were to give you another example for a first class lever system, we might talk about a tricep extension or a football throw. So in that particular situation, the fulcrum will be the elbow because that's the joint, that's where the movement occurs. The tricep would be the effort because that's the muscle that contracts and produces the movement. And the resistance would be either the dumbbell that I'm using or the football that I'm throwing. For a second class lever system, we might start to look at the ankle in different scenarios. So You could look at a calf raise. You could look at the starting position when exploding out of the blocks in a 100-meter sprint. You could also look at running in general. So the fulcrum would be the actual ball of the foot, where we see the crease in a person's trainer. That would be the fulcrum, because that acts as the joint. The effort would be the muscle in the lower leg located at the back, which is known as the gastrocnemius. I'm sure you understand that. And resistance would be the person's body weight. For a third class lever system, we'd start to look at something like a bicep curl. So in this scenario, the effort will be the bicep, because it's the muscle that contracts and shortens, causing the movement to take place. The fulcrum will be the joint, which is the elbow. And then the resistance will be the dumbbell, the weight that the person is lifting as they perform the exercise. And let's move on to mechanical advantage. So a second class lever system has a mechanical advantage. And the reason being is that the resistance arm is short. This basically means that the distance between the resistance and the fulcrum is shorter than the distance of the fulcrum and the effort. Okay, so there's a long effort arm here between the fulcrum and the effort. What that means is when you perform an exercise like a calf raise, the input force, which is the effort, is actually minimal, but the output force is great. So if I were to ask you to perform a calf raise now, I'm sure you know from experience it's quite an easy exercise to perform, and therefore it requires minimal effort, but the outcome is great because it moves the entire body. And moving on to a third class lever system, it has a mechanical disadvantage, because unlike the second class lever system, it has a short effort arm instead of long. So the distance between the fulcrum and the effort is short, but the resistance arm is long. So the fulcrum and resistance are further apart. So for that reason, it has a mechanical disadvantage. So we are on today's final topic, which is to look at the effective use of warming up and cooling down. So let's begin with warming up. There are 3 stages to every effective warm-up. The first part being a gradual pulse raiser. And the idea of this part of the warm-up is to increase your pulse. So the idea being that through walking, jogging, skipping, bounding, sidestepping, you're beginning to increase your breathing rate and heart rate. So this allows more oxygen-rich blood to be transported around the body to working muscles. So it helps prepare us for the game that we're about to partake in. The second part of the warm-up is also very important, so stretching. We have to stretch warm muscles. So this always comes after the pulse raiser. So through stretching, not only do we reduce the chances of injury, but we increase the range of movement possible at a joint. So we improve flexibility, which actually has a positive impact on performance. Not only this, but I think stretching can be a good time to actually mentally and psychologically prepare for a competitive game. The third part of a warm-up consists of a skill-based activity, and here you familiarise yourself with the skills you're likely to use in a game. So for example, as a football player, before competing in a competitive game, I might partake in a passing drill, and the idea is that I familiarise myself with the technique involved when passing with my left foot, right foot, and so on. So the idea being that when I go into a game situation, I'm more likely to execute the skill. And then finally, following exercise, we have cooling down. Now, in the first part of the cool down, you want to maintain elevated breathing rate and heart rate and blood flow by carrying out a jog, for example. But as the cool down progresses, you'll start to decrease the intensity of the cool down, so you gradually lower your breathing rate, heart rate, and blood flow. Alongside this, you might stretch also, just to help stretch out the muscles and remove any lactic acid from the body. So this collectively will help the recovery process, which is less likely to lead to delayed onset muscle soreness the following day. Guys, thank you for joining me in today's video. There is one topic that I've intentionally missed out, and that is the fitness components. I am planning to make another video or a series of shorts where I discuss each of these in detail, but you will have those to look forward to, I promise. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found it helpful. Good luck in your exams this year, and please, 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 if you do have any questions or concerns, please just share them in the comment section below. I am more than happy to help. Thanks for joining me. Take care. See you again soon.